Welcome to Forbes Movies. Joining me now is Dani Di Placido, a Forbes senior contributor. Dani, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, recently in Forbes, you wrote a piece about review bombing in the new Billy Eichner rom-com called Bros. But first, before we get into all that, I want you to walk us through what is review bombing.
Review bombing is when a group of, I suppose you can kind of call them activists to some degree. A bunch of people will get together and decide preemptively that they don't like not so much the movie, but the messages that are perceived to be within the movie. And so they will cluster on a review site like Rotten Tomatoes, IMDb, and they will like plummet the score as low as they can by all giving it 1 star. And this is usually before the movie has even been released.
And are these bots, or are they all real people? Or a mixture?
I think it's a mixture. And it's not like most people don't really take the time to leave a user review. So if you don't really need that many people to like sway the numbers, but I'm sure there's been bot campaigns in the past as well. Although from what I understand, the review sites are getting better at weeding out that kind of thing.
Got it. And what groups are usually targeted in these review bombing campaigns?
It's anyone perceived to deviate from the white heterosexual norm, so to speak. So any film or TV series that has diverse casting, a non-heterosexual, love plot line, that's pretty much it, to be honest. I mean, I'm sure that there would be campaigns directed against more kind of politically leaning movies, but we don't really see much of that. It's mostly just like within the diverse casting.
And let's say you're on a movie review site, you're deciding if you want to see a movie, maybe you're on Rotten Tomatoes. How can you tell a movie is being review bombed versus people might just not like the movie?
Well, the lines are a little blurred sometimes, but I would say that if the movie hasn't actually been released yet and it's suddenly got a cluster of 1-star reviews, I think that's a pretty sure sign. There's usually a lot of media attention around these things to kind of alert you to the fact that the review bombing campaign might have been taking place. Like when Star Wars The Last Jedi came out, it's all, it was everywhere on the internet. It was quite hard to escape the noise. Same with something like Captain Marvel, or more recently, Amazon's The Rings of Power, which is why I kind of found the Bros review bombing campaign to be a strange one, because, it wasn't really, it's a big enough movie, Billy Eichner and all that, but it wasn't a huge, massive campaign behind it. There wasn't that much attention being paid to in the first place. So I was kind of surprised that a group of people took the time to lower its score.
And you mentioned that it is online. You saw it all over Twitter for certain movies. Does this hateful conversation live exclusively in the depths online, maybe just Twitter, or does it go into the mainstream?
I think it's definitely bleeding out into the real world. I mean, like everything that happens online these content creators, they are influencers. You've got a whole kind of anti-woke industry that exists on YouTube now that really, a lot of them only seem to review films through that lens of whether or not the messages that are being conveyed are, woke, whatever that means, or not. And so I think it kind of starts to change the way certain people perceive these movies, where they just switch them off straight away if they feel like they're being preached to, let's say.
And I want to... Oh, continue.
I'm just going to say it's just a very reductive way to view media. I just don't think it's very valuable.
No, I agree. And I want to specifically turn to the review bombing of Bros. Why was Bros review bombed?
There was no controversy around this film that I was aware of. There wasn't any obnoxious marketing campaign. It was just a fairly high-profile romantic comedy that happens to star 2 gay guys. As far as I can see, that would be the only reason. So I would imagine that these review bombing trolls just don't want messages like this to be normalized. They want it. There's this kind of mantra that they repeat to themselves, this whole go woke, go broke, which never seems to come true. A lot of these movies with diverse casts and non-heterosexual plot lines or whatever, they do well. They're doing well at the box office. They're not collapsing. So I think they believe they can make a difference if they can cause enough of them to fail through these coordinated campaigns, that maybe things will go in the other direction. But it doesn't. It seems to me like rolling a rock up a hill. I don't really see why you would spend your time doing that.
I don't see why you would spend your time doing that either. But have these historically, has review bombing made a difference in terms of the box office?
I mean, that Ghostbusters all-female reboot was like kind of the jumping off point for this happening in film. And it didn't do great at the box office. I don't think it was a disaster, but it's hard to say because maybe that movie just wasn't that great, or like maybe it just wasn't really what Ghostbusters fans wanted. But I haven't really seen it tank a film before. Maybe because usually these are really, really big franchises, like Disney remakes, the Rings of Power, the Lord of the Rings property. It'd be kind of hard for it to tank. But I think something like Bros is maybe small enough to be affected negatively by that. But I also think that the increased media attention would maybe be more likely to spark the curiosity of the audience. So once maybe they'll read about it in a capacity they didn't before and be like, well, I want to go see it. What's the fuss all about? As you were saying with Don't Worry, Darling, that aroused my curiosity, all the drama around the film, more than anything.
Exactly. So it kind of sounds like it's working. It's having the opposite effect that these people are intending it to have.
I believe so. And that seems to have kind of soaked into their conspiracy theory, where they believe they are being baited into doing this so that the film can cynically kind of use them as part of their marketing campaign.
Interesting. And at the time of the review bombing of Bros, like you said earlier, that one way to spot a review bombed movie is the movie isn't even released yet and it's already tanking. Bros was only screened at the Toronto International Film Festival. So how was it received there?
It was well received. It has 95% on Rotten Tomatoes. Can't deny that. That's a high score. I don't really think anyone had some massive major problem with it. I'm sure it's not going to be to everyone's taste, but it was very suspicious that all the reviews were so glowing compared to all these negative 1-star reviews that just suddenly flooded in from all these people who I don't really think had the chance to see it in the first place.
And did IMDb react to the review bombing?
They removed the score. And this has happened before. In Rotten Tomatoes, it was either in the wake of Black Panther or Captain Marvel. Actually, they had a cool down period on their reviews so that nobody can leave comments and user reviews until the film has actually been released, which I understand. And Amazon did the same thing in reaction to the Rings of Power, where they suspended user reviews for, I believe, 72 hours after the Rings of Power came out. I suppose just to try and allow people to watch it for themselves before they get caught up in the noise. So
they took it down, but is there anything else proactively IMDb could do beforehand to kind of safeguard this from happening again?
They could do what Rotten Tomatoes did. They could have that cool down period, like so that you can't have user reviews on a movie before it is released. But then there's a whole other debate there when you're like, well, review bombing is not always necessarily a hateful, big or negative thing. I mean, you've got that. There was the case of what's her name, but the musician Sia, when she made that film called Music, that had, from what I understand, harmful depictions of autism, and it was review bombed from people with autism or campaigners who believed that it was communicating some very harmful messages, and they wanted to show their displeasure for it before it was released. And that's a different story.
Got it. So other than that, is there any way that is review bombing always exclusively negative, or is there ever like a positive review bombing?
Well, yeah, I think the one I just cited was positive, and I do think consumers have the right to say that they don't like something, But the way things are now with this whole kind of this atmosphere of the whole like kind of the anti-woke campaigners, it's kind of muddying the waters. But I don't think it's not exclusively a negative thing. But when you do hear about it, it is usually in the context of some kind of bigoted like outburst.
And what I mean by positive, like, would there be a group coming together to only leave positive reviews despite never seeing the movie?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, that happens as well. Yeah. Yeah. From what I understand, like, you've got certain fandoms that really base their identity on their chosen franchise, and they want other people to go see it. So they'll love bomb it before the film is released as well.
And in Forbes, in your recent piece in Forbes, you say review bombing is common among toxic fandoms. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so it's this, as I said, this kind of warped form of activism where these fandoms are kind of riling themselves up. They perceive themselves to be threatened in some way. They perceive the status quo to have been threatened, and they're lashing out by conducting these kind of review bombing campaigns to try and push against what they perceive to be an attack on them.
And a fandom sounds like it would be a good thing, people coming together because they like to support something. So when does it make this transition to this sort of toxic place?
Yeah, you'd think it would be a positive thing, wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the negative stuff kind of, I guess, it overshadows the positivity because there's just no reason to read about the positive stuff. It's not as dramatic. So I do think it's in the minority, but I think it comes from a place of entitlement. You can see it definitely with like the Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, where people are like, this is my story. It doesn't belong to anyone else. I don't want anyone else to enter it or enjoy it to the same extent that I do. And it's just it's just a weird way to view yourself as this kind of consumer who is fed products specifically to your taste. Like you think you'd want your chosen story to challenge you in some way.
Wouldn't you want your chosen story to include as many people as possible? Like I would think you would want a larger fandom.
But
of course.
Yeah.
You don't want to shut people out of the storytelling process. You want to see diverse perspectives. These are not just buzzwords. They will make your story better. You can see it when you're watching films that are made, even in the 90s. You can see these kind of clumsy, heavy-handed stereotypes that exist within the film, and they don't look cool. They kind of damage the film's credibility years after.
Can you give an example of one?
I mean, off the top of my head, me and my wife have been like binge watching Friends recently, and even that it's not a particularly problematic show, but you can just see this weird, clunky depiction of certain things, like the weird Monica's like fat shaming, this horrible like shadow that was over her life that she used to be overweight once, or Chandler's depiction of his trans father, which I suppose was as progressive it could be at the time, but it comes across very heavy-handed now and very like, just a bit like, ooh.
Billy Eichner did respond to the review bombing campaign, but in general, do you think that there needs to be a response to these incidents, or do you think that it's kind of giving this type of oxygen to either racist, misogynistic, homophobic trolls that they're kind of craving?
I think it is, to be honest. It is giving them oxygen to a certain degree, but it's complicated because I do think it needs to be kind of called out for what it is. Like there's been I do think it's better for the studios to address it directly. We've been seeing more of that. For example, Amazon came to the defense of its cast in the Rings of Power. The same thing with The Boys on Amazon as well. They came to the defense of the actress playing Starlight, who was subject to some kind of misogynistic hate campaign. And we saw even the old actors from the original beloved Lord of the Rings trilogy come out and say, this is not Middle Earth, is for everyone. And the same thing with Star Wars as well. You even had not just the studio, but you had Ewan McGregor come out, film this video where he kind of told people, like, we don't really want you in the fandom if you're going to behave like this. Because I think, although it is giving some degree of oxygen, you can't really let these people dictate the narrative. There will be a point, I think, we just move past these conversations where they're so normalized. This is not, I do think it's already happening to some degree, but I think it's best to keep pushing them out and eventually the flame will die down.
And when the stars or studios speak out against this and say, listen, that's not what the fandom's all about, do the conversations tamp down? Do they listen to them, or does it ramp it back up?
It can ramp it up, I think, briefly, where these content creators can kind of frame this as an attack on them. But I think overall, it just kind of dampens their credibility and kind of makes them out to be these fools who are yelling at the TV. And I think most people are just like, why are you still so angry about this?
Dani Di Placido, thank you so much for joining me today, giving us all of your entertainment insight, and I hope that you come back and join us soon.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.